Hi, how are you? Thanks for coming back. I'm aware there's a danger of this channel turning into a litany of death and destruction, so I don't want it to go that way. I'd like to introduce some lighter topics from time to time, and here's some quirky little things you may not be aware of. You might be aware of some of them. If you're aware of all of them, well done. Start your own YouTube channel. Right, first off, if you ever borrow a car, if you ever hire a car, you've got to refill it. You're often in a quandary as to which side the filler cap is on. You get out and check. Actually, all cars have a tiny symbol right next to the pump symbol on your fuel gauge. Little arrow that shows you which side you need to fill from. Not a lot of people know that, and the way this works is you'll have forgotten this by the end of the video, and then when you come to do it, to need that information, it's only after you get out and check, you sit back in, that's when you remember. It's just the way that works. Another quirky little thing now. Right, next thing is heavyweight boxing. There was a time when everybody knew the heavyweight champion of the world and everybody was interested in any fight for the heavyweight championship title of boxing title of the world. This is before sports channels, pay-per-view, all that kind of stuff has limited that now to just sports fans really care about that. But there was a time heavyweight champions were big news. Tens of thousands of people would turn up for the fights, and they'd be carried on the radio, on the TV. Everybody be talking about them. One particular champion back in the 30s was involved in two very famous fights, and his name was Max Baer, B-A-E-R. Born in Omaha, Nebraska, moved to California with his family. He was 1/4 Jewish. His most famous fight was probably against Max Schmeling, who was backed by Hitler and the Nazis as being an example of a good Aryan fighter. Even though in reality he was a bit embarrassed by that, he was presented, and the fight was presented as being a fight between the Nazis and the people who were against him. In this case, he was 1/4 Jewish, Max Baer, but he fought with the Star of David on his trousers. He wasn't a practicing Jew or anything. But the promoters made a big deal of this, the Jewish fighter against the Nazi fighter in 1933. And Max Baer won. Schmeling went on to become a paratrooper. He was involved in the paratroop landings on Crete for the Germans, and after the war ended up running a bottling plant. He'd been beaten by Joe Louis later in his career, and the two of them became friends later in life, and he actually helped out Joe Louis financially. He had hidden two Jewish girls during a roundup of Jews in Berlin at one point in his life, so he wasn't particularly Nazi himself, but the Nazis had latched onto him, and it was a big high-profile fight, Max Baer versus Max Schmeling. He wasn't the hero of the second fight he was in. Max Baer, when he was world heavyweight champion, one of the contenders he had to fight, they cast around and they picked this guy who was, it's like a true life Rocky story, to be honest, a guy called Jim Braddock. Now there's a movie made about this fight with Russell Crowe. It's called Cinderella Man. Max Baer was a tough fighter. He hit hard. He killed a man in the ring. One other man badly hurt that died in the following fight. That was probably something to do with the Max Baer fight. But he was presented in the movie Cinderella Man as being quite nasty, and I think from what I can read, that's all hyped up a bit. He wasn't such a nasty character at all. But Braddock was certainly the hero of the second fight. This guy, down on his luck, chance in a million, like Rocky, chance in a million to fight a champion, and he actually won and became the champion of the world. So that fight is available online on YouTube, and it comes the real fight, I mean, and it comes as an extra on the DVD disc for Cinderella Man. Now, two top fights, both regarded as possible fights of the year by sports writers. Sports writers used to be a thing too back in the old days. What's so quirky about this, you're wondering? What's interesting about Max Baer is who his son was. His son, you'd know, anybody my generation would know, Max Baer Jr. plays in the Beverly Hillbillies as Jethro Bodine.
The Beverly Hillbillies. Didn't know it was me, did you?
A face that would make anybody smile if you know that program, and if you know Jethro Bodine. Right, on to the next thing. Roman numerals and clocks. Okay, you all know Roman numerals. I don't know, do they teach Roman numerals in school anymore? If they don't, brief overview. Roman numerals use 1 for 1, 2 for 2, and so on. To make things less unwieldy, they have other symbols for 5, a V, an X for 10. And so if you want to make 12, you go X11, or II, XII. 10, 1, 1 is 12. 14 is 1 before 5, X, and then the 1 before 5, 14, 10 and 4. And so on up. The great thing about Roman numerals is they're all straight lines up to 100. So if you want to make a mark on something, if you're cutting a groove in a stone to make a milestone, or if you want to make marks on wood, on the pillars of a suppose you're a Roman army corralling your horses and you want to number all the corrals, you could easily make the numbers because they're straight lines. You could slash them, you could take a branding iron, you could do any number you want with just one branding iron. So that's what's so handy about them. They don't have a zero, so you can't do complicated maths with them. There's no zero in the whole Roman system. What's quirky about this? Clocks. You know the number 4 in Roman numerals, I'm sure you do. Next time you see a clock with Roman numerals, check out the number 4. For some reason, clocks traditionally don't use the normal 4, they use 4 ones. Why? There's two theories. One is that optically, visually, aesthetically, it's nicer, it's more balanced, the face of the clock, if they use 4 ones. It's not all busy on the other side. I don't buy that really. The other theory I think is more plausible, is that if you are making clocks and you want to say have a sheet of tin, and you want to cut out the numerals from a sheet of tin and apply them to the face of the clock. If you use 4 ones, it means there's a particular set of numerals that you can stamp out a couple of times and use them, rather than have to make an allowance for the 4. You can do the one particular set and do that all the time and make your clock figures out of that if you use the 4 ones. It's more tricky if you have the correct 4. And I'd say that's probably more to do with it, the economic reason. Right. Okay, next quirky little thing is about the movie The Planet of the Apes. The original movie Planet of the Apes, based on a book. Now, actually, the book is by a fella called Pierre Boulle. He's a Frenchman. The book doesn't have the same twist as the 1968 movie. The book has a different twist. The people who made the movie came up with this idea, which I won't spoil if you haven't seen it. The thing about Pierre Boulle is he's really known for that book and one other book. Surprisingly, the other book he's known for is The Bridge on the River Kwai, both written by the same guy, Pierre Boulle, a Frenchman who actually worked as an agent for the Free French, in World War II, in that part of the world, and at one point had to swim down a river to escape. He was held captive for a long time by the Vichy French, and part of his experience are based on that. So, Planet of the Apes, Bridge on the River Kwai, same guy. Right, next, what's the next little interesting thing? Right, here's a little book, First Aid in the Royal Navy. This isn't dated, but I'm pretty sure it's from somewhere between 1905 and 1910. So it's more than 100 years old. It's no big deal these days having a book more than 100 years old, actually. It only has to be older than 1920s, so it used to be a big deal to have a book 100 years old, but there's plenty of them now. This book doesn't refer to anything that gives you an idea of the time, except for it refers to things that were learned when the Russians were fighting the Japanese, which was 1904, 1905. So it's obviously pre-World War One. Electric shock. This is an accident which is every day becoming more possible in the Navy with the extensive use of electricity. Little need be said about it. A man touches a live wire, he has a sudden spasm with severe pain and he cannot let go. The rescuer, in dragging him away from the wire, may receive a shock himself unless he wear an insulating material on his hands such as India rubber or thick, dry woolen mittens. A tobacco pouch or mackintosh may be used for this purpose. Or, and this is the quirky bit, the rescuer may spring in the air, and while in the air, touching nothing, he should grab at the patient, but he must let go before he returns to the ground. The patient being rescued must then be treated for shock. Official guidance, first aid in the Royal Navy: spring into the air, pull the patient free and release him before returning to the ground. So now you know. That was obviously written by somebody who knew a little bit of the principles of electricity, but didn't really think it through. For one thing, if you are able to remain in the air for any length of time and grab at a patient, unless you're huge and he's tiny, you're only going to pull yourself towards him, and you don't get to choose when you return to the ground. First aid in the Royal Navy, about 1908, something like that. Right. Okay, getting back to some nautical stuff. Why are toilets called heads on ships? A couple of theories about this. One is that the bow of the ship used to be called the head, and that's why toilets are called the heads, because they used to use that part of the ship just after the bowsprit, where waves would be continually washing the side of the ship. That's where men would go to relieve themselves. Other people say it's because the figurehead is up there, and in older ships there used to be a figurehead and a bit of a platform below it that people could go onto. A slightly more believable one, I think, is that there used to be a feature of a wooden post that was fixed either side of the bowsprit, and these would project up on the deck, and they were called Nightheads. They were two big thick pieces of wood with a square top, and presumably they're called Nightheads because they looked a bit like the helmets that knights used to wear in the old days. Sometimes these Nightheads would actually be carved with faces. Nothing like the figurehead now. This is slightly further after the figurehead, on the foredeck, either side of the bowsprit. And that's where people used to go, to the Nightheads, the heads. Night, K-N-I-G-H-T we're talking about here, by the way. So that's what I think is probably more likely, that it was where the Nightheads became known as the heads. Right, one more nautical thing. Why are destroyers called destroyers? Because in the old days, if you had a big ship, it was like a floating fortress. It was more or less untouchable, except another big ship came along. So if you wanted to go and threaten some small principality or something, you could send a ship, and the ship would go and threaten to bombard the town, and nobody could do much about it. Ships then became very vulnerable when a fellow called Robert Whitehead invented the torpedo. Torpedo was a weapon that would be fired, and initially they were looking at firing it from shore, but then they realized, and guiding it with ropes, then they realized it could be launched from vessels. And you didn't need a big vessel, you needed a small vessel. So a small vessel with a torpedo, warhead full of explosive, compressed air driving the engine, and let it go, And you could take out a massive ship that took years to build with hundreds of men on board, all with a small boat and a torpedo or two. When they had the fleet review in the 1890s at Spithead, a ship turned up. It was a steamship using steam turbine. And it wasn't a ship, it was a boat. And it was called Turbinia. And it wasn't officially supposed to be there. And it zoomed around in and out of all the ships that were there for the fleet review, caused consternation because it was travelling at a speed that nobody had seen before, which shocked everybody. Steam turbine for the first time, really. So all you needed was some fast vessel like that with torpedoes, and you'd be a huge risk to battleships. What was needed was a vessel to combat these torpedo boats that everybody was expecting were going to have a big impact on naval affairs. So they developed a torpedo boat destroyer, a class of ship that could itself fire torpedoes, but primarily was there to stop torpedo boats getting near the big ships. And destroyers have really done escort duty ever since with big ships. They're fast, they're maneuverable, they can get from one side of a convoy to another quickly to intercept a threat. They will protect, these days they will protect against aircraft as well. They'd be basically the first line of defense for any major ship. But the reason they were called destroyers, because the original term was torpedo boat destroyer. They were known as TBDs. And TBDs eventually got replaced with the term destroyer as a shorthand for it. Well, there you are now. That's a few quirky little facts you might find interesting. Might get back to some more serious stuff next time. Bye now. Mind yourselves.